All you got to do is open the door, step outside, and there you are.
There you are?
Yeah.
There you are where?
Outside.
Well, suppose you want to get back in again.
You had no right to go out.
It's the Marx Brothers Council Podcast, episode 66, The Little We Know About Leonard. I'm Sean Connery, and joining me as usual is Noah Diamond. Noah, you've got some big news for us.
I do, Matthew. The New York crew, my New York Marx Brothers crew, responsible for producing the original Marx Fest 10 years ago, which is something to consider, has decided that we haven't fully learned our lesson and we're going to do it again this year. 2024 just seemed like the perfect time to bring back the idea of a big Marx Brothers festival in New York City, because this is the 100th anniversary of the original New York opening of I'll Say She Is, and it's the 110th anniversary of Home Again, besides being the 10th anniversary of Marx Fest itself. So if you add all of that up and divide by a 7-cent nickel, you can figure out we're all 1,000 years old. So this May in New York City, over 2 weekends, May 17th to the 19th in Manhattan, and May 24th to the 26th at Coney Island, Brooklyn, we're going to have something like 20 or 25 great Marx Brothers events for you. We're still confirming events. Lots of things are still kind of in the planning stages, but we've announced 5 so far, 5 great events at our website, marxfest.org, including a conversation with comedy legend Robert Klein, an appearance by one of our most popular Marx Brothers Council podcast guests, John Tefteller, at which he'll be playing some rare Marx Brothers audio nobody has ever heard before, and the ultimate I'll Say She Is centennial experience, where not only will we explore the original production in more detail than we have before, but I will also be sharing more than I've shared before of the 2016 production. So that's just a little taste of what, as I say, more than 20 great Marx Brothers events in New York City in May. Tickets are not yet on sale, but when they are, they'll be at marxfest.org. We do have a crowdfunding campaign, which is currently active. As I record this, it's been active for less than a week, but we're more than halfway to our goal, $15,000 in the crowdfunding campaign, to help defray the expenses of getting these wonderful guests to New York City and throwing the greatest festival in the history of human civilization. I have now told you everything that there is to say about Marx Fest so far. So as the questions inevitably pour in, the answer to most of them will be, we're going to announce that soon. But in the months ahead, the picture will come into clearer focus. And Marx Brothers fans, I hope you can plan to be in New York this May.
So just one more time with the email address that people can follow your progress?
Marxfest.org is the website.
Website address.
Marxfest.org is the website. There's an email address, too, info@marxfest.org. That's the place to send all those questions that I don't yet have the answers to.
Well, we devoted a podcast to Chico Marx with Travesty way back in the early days of the Council podcast, but we're going to take another look at Chico again now because I think he amply rewards the attention. Chico is in many ways, I think, the most mysterious of the brothers. Everything we know about him is second-hand. What we do know sounds fascinating and suggests that he could well have been the most interesting of them all. Yet he's the only one of the 3 main brothers to have left us no memoir and no major retrospective interview. A few scattered contemporary interview quotes and Kyle Crichton's biography, the Chico sections of which, though written in the third person, are the closest we'll get to a Chico version of Harpo Speaks, are all we have. And there are so many Chico what-ifs. This is the one that blows my mind the most. What if Groucho had died in the early 60s and Chico had been the lone survivor into the 70s? The trajectory of their career would have been unchanged and Groucho would still have had his success with You Bet Your Life, but it would have been Chico, not Groucho, that the world would have turned to when the great Marx revival happened at the end of the 60s? Or would it have happened? Was it simply because everyone suddenly remembered how great those movies were? Would it still have happened if all the brothers had been dead? Or was a huge part of it the fact that their dominating presence was still around and still, to some extent, recognisably that guy that you see in the movies? How might that dynamic have changed if we switched Chico for Groucho? Can we even imagine him chatting to Dick Cavett or reminiscing at Carnegie Hall? Well, there are just one or two very small hints of what that might have been like. For instance, there's a 1942 radio interview of Chico when he's starting out as a band leader, having finally, he thought said goodbye to the Marx Brothers as an act. So he's in slightly retrospective mood. So that has something of the feel of a later television interview, if only such a thing existed. Here's a small extract from that.
Were your parents on the stage before you, Chico?
No, Tobe. But my mother's brother was Al Sheen of Gallagher and Sheen. You see, she loved the stage, and she wanted us to follow in the footsteps of our famous uncle.
Well, she really got her wish, Chico. How did you go about it?
Well, you see, Groucho always had a good voice. You see, he sings pretty good yet, that is when he cuts out his clowning.
Which is kind of tough, I suppose.
Oh, yeah, it's a pretty tough. And Harpo taught himself to play the harp when he found an old harp in the attic left by my grandmother.
Well, believe me, he plays that harp all right. What was the start of the act as we know it today, Chico?
Well, Groucho, Harpo, and Zeppo were doing an act together at Waukegan, and my mother took me to see them. They didn't know I was coming. They hadn't been home in 5 years.
Well, I can imagine that was quite a reunion. No, it isn't what you think. He could have gone home. He just hadn't been home. Were they surprised to see you, Chico?
You bet they were. You see, I asked the orchestra leader to see it to let me play the piano for their act. They didn't know I was there. He was a tired violin player. Maybe you heard of him.
Yeah, I think I know a tired violin player by the name of Ben Burney.
No, it's the other one, Jack Benny.
Well, I should have suspected when you mentioned Waukegan. Tell me, what happened when your brother spotted you out there in the orchestra?
Well, you see, Harper saw me first. He had an orange under his hat that he used in the act. So he took it out and hit me right on the head with it. I threw it back and hit Groucho. And the act broke up with us throwing things at each other. The audience thought it was all part of the act, and they hated us and their fellas. They decided to put me in it.
Well, I'm inclined to go right along with the audience, too. That gives us a good picture of the start of the Marx Brothers style of comedy.
I always hate that when comedians say, and there was somebody on the stage who and then they build up to the name. I mean, it obviously, it worked well there because he got a huge laugh, but there's something about it that because I always see it coming, when there's just this reference to something. All right, he's gonna make a punchline out of the person's name there.
Artificial suspense, yes.
Yeah. There's also a later 1950s interview on British television, a program called Showtime, I think, which I think if you kind of squint and put your fingers in your ears and wiggle them about, could almost be Chico at Carnegie Hall.
A lot of people ask me, are we really brothers, and can Harpo talk, and how'd you get your name? Is he going to make any more pictures? Harpo can really talk. If you don't think he can talk, just play golf with him and let him miss a putt that big. You'll hear him talk. How we got our names is a very interesting thing. When we were kids in school, we used to wear a little bag goes around the neck, was called a grouch bag. In this bag, we would keep our pennies, our marbles, piece of candy, little marijuana, whatever we could pick up. What we were studying to be musicians. And Groucho got his name from the bag. It was always full.
Yes.
And Harpo had a bag, too, but he got rid of it. I got my name when I was about 15 years of age. I used to chase the chickens. I still chase them, but I don't catch them anymore. And I'm just waiting for a rainy day. I'm good in the mud.
Chico, could I say that during the last couple of days I've enjoyed your company more than I can tell you, and those wonderful stories. I'd love you to tell the true story you told me about the little girl.
Well, right before I came to England, I went into a hotel, and a little girl, about 3.5 years old, she came in with a baby carriage. Had a little doll in. You know how you get when you see a little baby. Oh, what a cute baby. She said, it's my baby. I said, yes, well, can I be an uncle? She says, no. She's got 3 uncles. I'm looking for a father. That's all.
A brief extract there from the best-selling LP, An Evening with Chico. Do you think he would still be doing the act if he was around then, or would he just be himself?
It's a good question. I say a lot of, but there aren't that many examples. But when we do get him in this kind of later in career interview mode, he seems to be walking a middle ground already. You know, the first clip that you played, he mostly seems to be doing it without the accent or with just a trace of the accent. So you can't even quite tell if he's putting it on or if this really is his natural speech. And then when the interviewer tries somewhat lamely to make a joke out of like how tough it is to get Groucho to be serious, Chico's response to that, when he goes into a little half-hearted comic bit, is clearly in dialect. He says, yes, it's a plenty tough, you know. And then he goes on talking more or less without the accent.
The other thing I wonder, of course, is everything we've got from him is adhering to the kind of broadcasting standards of the 40s and 50s, and I wonder how liberated he would have been in later years. What an unrestricted Chico might have been like in the age of Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor. I mean, you can just imagine him letting it all hang out with Richard and Nobley.
Maybe, but it's funny. In a way, it's harder to imagine. And I feel that even though this is sort of the opposite of who they really were, essentially, it feels like Chico, in an interview context, was a more uptight guy than Groucho.
Yeah, he comes across that way, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think it's because he had genuinely had more to hide, you know? Like, Chico actually was this kind of libertine, this barbarian. And so whenever there was a camera pointed at him, he was almost pretentious at times, you know? In fact, these interviews, he's being a little more the avuncular entertainer. But in some of the early press interviews that we've looked at from the vaudeville and Broadway years, when every once in a while you'd get Chico quoted by a reporter. Sometimes he was surprisingly pretentious about comedy. He was very, speaking theoretically, a lot of $10 words. Whereas Groucho, because the person he truly was this kind of restrained Victorian, kind of uptight, clean-cut guy. But his trademark was to be just the opposite in terms of his comic persona. Chico very well might have just played the milquetoast with Anoboli.
Well, we could go on playing these what if games forever. That's very much my point. Chico is the brother that we have to imagine off screen, stitching together bits and pieces of other people's reminiscences to approximate the real man. What seems to me by far the best and most invaluable single source for we would-be Frankensteins is the book Growing Up with Chico, written in 1980 by his daughter Maxine. It's a short book and an informal one, but it really does impart a flavour of the man, and also of his wife Betty, of Minnie and Frenchie, of the other brothers, and of its author, who comes across as astute, sensitive, feisty, and very intelligent. Before moving on to Chico and the book, actually, I think we probably should say a word or two about Maxine, because she does seem to have been quite a formidable character in her own right, doesn't she?
Yeah, she certainly does seem to have been. And lots of people, even separate from Marx Brothers circles, a lot of people, because she was a casting director, a casting agent in New York City for many years. And a lot of people in New York acting circles have memories of her. And sometimes when you mention the Marx Brothers in certain New York art circles, the first response you'll get is, oh, I had some run-ins with Maxine in the 70s and the 80s. So yes, that's all true. I can't quite say that I really met Maxine, but I was in the same room with her once when I was 15 and saw Animal Crackers at the Goodspeed Opera House. She was in attendance that performance. She was with two young men who I would later come to understand were Paul Wesolowski and Robert Bader. And we had a little moment waving at her and sort of had a brief hello moment. that lady understood that those children understood that she was Chico Marx's daughter. And in later years, I was talking once to Paul Wesolowski, and I said, well, I didn't really meet her. I didn't really get to talk to her, but, she seemed lovely. And Paul broke into a snorting laugh and said, I've never heard her described that way before.
Yeah, lots of people have got their little Maxine anecdote, haven't they? They say, "Oh yes." Very often as well, people say, "I'd been talking to her for some time before I realised who she was." She wasn't kind of I'm Chico's daughter, but she was quite the opposite, and it kind of dawned on them, and they said, "Hang on a minute, are you Chico's daughter?" Lots of people seem to have memories like that.
Yeah, a lot of people have said that she had the same kind of crooked smile that he had. People saw something in her smile that was very suggestive of Chico. And she does seem to have been a somewhat sardonic, sarcastic, humorous person who didn't suffer fools gladly.
Yes.
Was able to marshal humor as a weapon when she needed to. Also, a lot of the people who have talked to me and us about her, including on this podcast, met her in situations where she was the powerful person in the room, casting them, deciding whether to give them a job or not. So Don Scardino, when we had him on, he talked about feeling too intimidated to ask her about Chico Marx. And
yes,
I think Jerry Soroka had a similar story, but he was perhaps slightly more daring and imitated Chico right to her. But yeah, it followed her around, and she was quite a presence.
I think of all the Marx children, the one she reminds me of most is Groucho's daughter Miriam. Both quite sort of bookish, erudite, and as you say, didn't suffer fools too easily.
Yeah, they do seem similar. Salty, caustic, Dorothy Parker-esque.
Yes. Well, and I want to ask you before we sort of dive into the book, what you thought of it and what your kind of history with it has been. I mean, I think I read it when I bought it, which was in the late 1980s, and then I read it again 10 years ago when I was writing the annotated Marx Brothers, when I basically read all the books in one huge marathon. I think this is the first time in kind of reflective adulthood that I've settled down with this book and this book alone, and it really came alive to me. I think it's quite a very fine piece of work, I thought.
I felt that way too, and I was somewhat surprised to feel that way. Very similar history with the book to yours. I read the book from cover to cover when I was 13 years old or something and was first getting immersed in this world. And maybe I revisited it once at some point over the years, but for the most part, after that initial reading, as we've said about so many of these books, we said this about Groucho and Me just a few episodes ago, I treated it like a reference book where I would go to it to look something up, to find some specific thing. Oh, I need to know how Maxine tells this particular anecdote, the sections dealing with Alsatias, I tend to have reread more and more recently for obvious research reasons. But yeah, until reading it for this episode, I'm not sure I really sat down and experienced this book as a single work beginning to end since I was basically a child. And it's very interesting to read it. Some of my impressions and memories were wrong, or else I had absorbed other people's opinions about the book and lost track of my own impressions. I had the idea that the book was sort of a box-checking exercise, that Maxine felt there really needs to be a book about Chico. At that time, there were several Groucho books. There was one Harpo book. And Maxine seems to have felt like it was her responsibility to just put a book on the shelf that was about Chico Marx. I do think that was important to her. But because of looking at the book through that prism, I sort of thought that was basically the beginning and end of what the book accomplishes. That it was a kind of sanitized, rose-colored, I love daddy view of somebody whose complexity was not going to be sufficiently explored by this particular author. And that I had kind of put it in the same category as we put a lot of the PR fluff that we hear about the Marx Brothers. Like, well, that's a take, but it's an ideological take, you know. Reading the book now, though, I find, yeah, there is some of that. She's protective of Chico in some ways, and she advocates for him in ways that other authors don't, but not without justification. And she also seems to me to have a pretty sober and clear-eyed view of who her father was, including all the unsavory things, all the disappointing and frustrating things about who he was. She says in a fairly stunning sentence late in the book. She says, Chico was a singularly selfish man. She's able to say those things about her father, and I was impressed with her candor. I also think we should say, apparently, her son, Brian Culhane, is the co-author of this book, as much as Roland Barber is Harpo's co-author, and Robert Bader is Susan Marx's co-author. He apparently, Brian Culhane, grandson of Chico, had much to do with shaping the text. Nevertheless, it is convincingly her voice, and a lot of the insights in it seem like they would have to have come directly from Maxine.
Yes, some of it I think is surprisingly penetrating. I think she's very astute. She's got a very good kind of way of looking back at things that she perceived at the time immaturely, because she was a child and a young person, and kind of reconsidering them and casting them in a new, and saying, well, now when I look back on it, I can see it's this. So it's far from just a trundle through some anecdotes. I think she really has gone through a kind of a soul searching exercise to get her thoughts down on the page, and right away, I think from the very first pages, you can see that there is kind of an original sort of take on things. She starts off instantly questioning some of the commonplaces. I think the third sentence, she's talking about Frenchie, and she says, but he was more than the handsome schlemiel that his sons later made him out to be. She talks on the first page about Shelley Winters in Minnie's Boys, saying that was a very good interpretation of Minnie, which is not something you see much of elsewhere. And she tells us that Chico was possessed less of an underlying coldness than his four brothers. He was, as Harpo once said, easily, if not deeply, moved. And throughout the book, we find her saying, these interesting observations. Particularly, I think about the other Marx Brothers. I mean, her portrait of the rather sour Groucho is one that we're very familiar with from other people's accounts. But I think this is pretty much the only book, isn't it, that gives us at least two, arguably three, negative Harpo anecdotes that I must say strike me as a welcome corrective to the kind of Saint Harpo that we get everywhere else.
Yes, indeed. And in those anecdotes and elsewhere too in the book, Maxine, more than Arthur Marx in his book, she really makes me stop and think, what a thing it was to have been a child in the middle of this whirlwind. I mean, this whirlwind that we think of as the Marx Brothers. Now, by the time Bill Marx, his book comes along, it's a little bit after this period. Miriam and Arthur and Maxine had this experience with the Marx Brothers in the 1920s and at the end of their vaudeville era, when things were just completely wild. And you do realize it was not always a very wholesome place to grow up. Even the title makes me, I feel differently about it now, like Growing Up with Chico. I used to think, what an all-purpose title that is, to write a book about your showbiz parent and call it Growing Up with a big star's name here. But no, Growing Up with Chico really had a lot to do with how this human being turned out. One of the negative Harpo stories that you mentioned is a fairly disturbing incident in which Harpo kind of uses Maxine. She's a very young child. He kind of uses her to help pick up this woman and then fool around with her on the plane with Maxine right there. And, it's like a kind of horrible story. And it's, it's disappointing and all that. And Maxine's perspective on it is so mature and so kind of tinged with sadness, but wisdom. She says, if I had told my friends about this, they probably would have thought, well, that's the Marx Brothers for you, as if they were describing some natural phenomenon, like a volcanic eruption that could be observed but never controlled. And you realize, oh, she grew up in an atmosphere where the adults could get away with anything. The adults had carte blanche to do whatever they felt like doing. And in her case, anyway, the child was left to just kind of wonder and try to learn about life through this particular scene. And she describes the kind of halting reluctance of her own sexual development later. You think, well, of course. I mean, of course. Is it the daughter of the Marx Brothers grew up feeling not entirely sure about men? Yeah, okay, I could buy that.
And it is a strange that throughout you do get that strange sense, don't you, of the two generations being reversed. She says at one point about how she and her friends didn't drink much, didn't take drugs, didn't have sex, and had a kind of quite a puritanical sort of attitude to life, and it was the parental generation that were the lawless ones.
Yeah, I mean, among other, I have some reactions to that are probably one could call clinical, but another one is just that's show business.
So let's sort of go through the book from the top. So at first we have the family prehistory, as it were, the Minnie and Frenchie stuff, which obviously we're familiar with. She whisks through that in about a page and a half. But then we get on to Chico's childhood, and it's these sections, I think, that make us ache most for a Chico memoir, because it's obvious that she's just dipping a toe into what she was exposed to growing up, which is a vast reservoir of anecdotes, as good as anything in Harpo Speaks.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the impression. One thing that's nice about this section, though, is to read it and discover it is not just a retread of what we've already read. She didn't just read the existing books. This actually does seem to be truly received, anecdotal stuff that she remembers being told, and that obviously has a lot more value.
I love the story about him stealing all that toilet paper. Is that in anything else? I didn't remember that.
Groucho tells that story, but he tells it a little differently. Groucho identifies the paper company as Klauber Horn. And that's on the Evening with Groucho LP and other places. But it's interesting to hear that story. Lots of Chico anecdotes that are familiar, but we've never heard them told, basically from Chico's point of view, or from a pro-Chico, from a pro-Chico source.
There's a few things, actually, isn't there, in there that we get a slightly different take on. I was quite towards the end of the book. She says quite surprisingly that that Margaret Dumont kind of hooked up with her for an evening, and they had they had spent some time together, and she says there that hang on, let me find it, page 151.
The boys ruined my career, she has Dumont say.
Yes, and Maxine says the boys could never break her up because she never thought they were funny, which is a slightly different and more believable version of she didn't get the jokes. It's she didn't like the jokes.
Yeah. Yes, and Maxine says of Dumont, she never realized what a great foil she had been and how much she had contributed to their movies. She was notorious for being without sense of humor. It jibes very well with what we were told about Dumont before, but it's not the way we see Dumont now, and it's not how we now understand her. It's interesting. It's like either Maxine's seemingly generally sharp analytical eye was just off when it came to Margaret Dumont, and Maxine is kind of accepting the legend, or, we know it's true that Margaret Dumont played that role in life as well. It wasn't like Groucho said she was just like her character and everyone believed him. And there was no reason to believe that. She did present that image, Anyway, yes, it is an interesting moment. And it's a case where we can sort of catch Maxine in like not being quite as savvy as she would be now.
So back to Chico the child, we get obviously all the expected stuff about him not being able to keep his pay packet for as long as it takes to get from his place of work to his house, and always dropping into the pool room and all that sort of thing. But we get some other interesting stuff too. We learn that he worked for a long time, or for a time rather, with a circus troupe. She tells us that he worked as a wrestler and a boxer for a time. And she also gives us some interesting stuff about his early act, Marx and Gordon, or Marx and Gordoni, as she says it evolved into, and she has him doing his Italian patter act starting from here. So we have a pre Marx Brothers origin of the Italian act. Is that all accurate?
Yeah, that all seems to be true, and it's laid out in some detail in Four of the Three Musketeers, Robert Bader's book. There's that Marx and Gordon period is interesting, and it became Marx and Gordoni when Minnie suggested that a European-sounding name would do them a little better. There was also an existing act called Gordon and Marx, the two hilarious Germans, or something like that. And Chico and Arthur Gordon apparently didn't mind the possible confusion that might result from these two names. Maxine specifically says that during the Arthur Gordon years, Chico developed one of his later trademarks, the Tootsie Fruitsie ice cream banter, which is interesting. I'm not sure that tidbit appears anywhere else. Certainly, I wasn't aware or haven't thought of that phrase or bit appearing anywhere outside of Day at the Races. So that is interesting. Maybe this is explored in another book, and it's fallen through one of the holes in my head. But it seemed strange to me. Also, in this section, I thought it was interesting in what she says about Chico's musical development. She says his talent was pretty special. He could sight read any piece of music and immediately transpose it into the key of C. Very interesting. And I've always wondered about this. What was Chico's level of musical literacy? We know, because it's been documented and explained in interesting detail by Bill Marx and others, that Harpo was not musically literate. He was an intuitive musician who played by ear, but musical notation was a foreign language to him. I've always wondered about Chico. Could he read music or not? None of the descriptions of his piano lessons seem to suggest that those lessons were very heavy on music theory, and the sense of Chico is that he just was intuitive and natural and effortless and sat down at the piano and just instinctively understood how it all worked. And we know that music theory is largely math, and we know that Chico had the mind of a brilliant mathematician. So it does make sense that being able to transpose in his head and understanding musical notation on an advanced level would be a natural thing for him. But because he was never interviewed in detail about music, and we don't have his firsthand thoughts about any of this, in a way, his musicianship, other than as a performer, is completely unexplored. So I was interested to see this. Okay, Chico could read music. He could sight read any piece of music and transpose it into the key of C without thinking about it. It's pretty amazing.
And she also, at the other end of the book, tells us that story about him looking at a dollar bill and memorizing the serial number and being able to say it forwards and backwards, and saying that if you come back to me in a year, I'll still be able to tell you. I mean, that I have no doubt that is true, but it points to a freakish kind of talent, doesn't it? Almost something diagnosable, I think, in modern terms.
Yeah, he was, and in a way, all these guys, they were sort of superheroes. They had powers.
Also, going back to what you were saying about the Tootsie Fruitsy thing, there's quite a few occasions in the book where she gives the impression of having imparting quite significant sort of little tidbits of knowledge, but not in a knowing way. So you don't ever kind of suspect that maybe she's making that up, because she doesn't seem to be aware of it herself. Like, for instance, the joke that eventually turns up in Duck Soup, "Tanks, you're welcome." She has as a running joke of hers much earlier. So it's almost like that was kind of remembered and put in almost to sort of please her, is the kind of the feeling you get, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right. You also realize that to her, the work of the Marx Brothers is a sidebar. To us, the lives of the Marx Brothers are a sidebar. Like, it feels to me like the Marx Brothers, their films, their characters, their work is so vivid. That feels like the real world. And then on the margins of that, as fans and followers and researchers, every now and then we get this glimpse of, like, oh my God, they were real people too. They walked the earth, they had lives and concerns. For someone like Maxine, who grew up in the middle of the whirlwind, it was just the opposite. Oh yeah, these very vivid, real people who I see every day also have this body of work. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Both that the tanks joke would have lived on in Groucho's mind as a way of joking around with his, nieces and nephews and children, and that to Maxine, like, every moment spent with these guys in real life, of course, was more memorable than whatever it was they did at work.
So as we move into Chico then being a Marx brother, we get the first most striking example of the advocacy that you mentioned, and it's worth quoting in full, I think, because it does kind of leap off the page. She says, "My father's true contribution to the act has never been fully realized because it hasn't been admitted. In his later years, Groucho would give Chico's efforts some due, but he did it with such a faint voice that no one heard. Yes, he would agree, if it hadn't been for Chico's insistence that they could be stars, they would never have gone anywhere. But Groucho didn't go on to say that they became a better act as a result of Chico's unwavering faith. The Marx Brothers were simply vaudevillians, albeit talented ones, like hundreds of others when they started in the business. Their artistry would not have blossomed were it not for my father's optimism. Groucho's black and envious moods certainly didn't help them to be great clowns, nor did Harpo's complacence, naivety, and inner security. Chico struck the happy medium and ran with it all over town, buttonholing any bookers and producers who would pay him notice. He was a wonderful salesman, becoming so enthusiastic that he carried other people along." So yeah, so there we clearly see the case for Chico being made.
This is one place where I feel Maxine overcorrects slightly. She's making many valid points here, and it's certainly undeniable that offstage, Chico's role as a sort of booster and cheerleader, as well as manager and business leader of the team, was very important in advancing their career and making breakthroughs happen for them, such as the breakthrough when they get to Broadway or when they start working with Irving Thalberg. But I think she goes a little too far and maybe gives Chico a little more credit than he deserves when she says, as you just quoted, their artistry would not have blossomed were it not for my father's optimism. Now we're talking about their artistry, not their success climbing the ladder of showbiz, but their artistry. Groucho's black and envious moods certainly didn't help them to be great clowns, nor did Harpo's complacency naivete, and inner security. Well, come on then. Of course, all of their personality traits helped them become great clowns. And, if Groucho hadn't had these black and envious moods, he wouldn't have been the wit that he was. He wouldn't have had the sense of humor and the attitude that he had. Harpo's naivete and inner security also obviously are one of the well springs of his specific humor and persona. So there is here, I think, a little, maybe an extra drop of "I love Daddy" that we don't necessarily need. However, her point about his importance to their advancement is inarguable.
And running in tandem with this, obviously, we then get the beginnings of the Chico and Betty story, which is sketched in, I think, with a really nice touch. I think it's very, very interestingly developed, and I think again her insights are very keen. It's all stuff that was new to me. I love the idea of him picking up girls by standing in front of the poster that he's on. That seems absolutely Chico, doesn't it?
3-sheeting, yes.
But yeah, it's very interesting because to some extent, Chico's marriage is mysterious in that he was seemingly the least likely person to get married of the brothers, and yet he was the first. That it was. Apart from Harpo's, I guess the longest lasting Marx marriage, numerically at least, although obviously not a largely happy one. But you sort of get the feeling when she describes their marriage that it almost worked. That they were well matched. That unlike Groucho's marriages, which seem to have been sort of on life support from the start, you really get the feeling that if he could have just turned the dial a little, this actually would have been a great love match. She seemed to have understood him. She obviously idolized him, and they seem to be on the same wavelength.
Yes, it's an interesting view. I think a lot of the accounts of Chico's life that we read from other sources, particularly other sources in the family, are so hard on Chico, or let's just say so concerned with pointing out the ways in which he was not a good husband, not a good partner, not a responsible brother or team member, that Betty winds up being painted as just the victim, just poor Betty who had to deal with Chico in all these various ways. But in Maxine's account, Maxine, of course, who knew her mother better than any other person who wrote about them, in Maxine's account, what really comes across is that Betty was a powerful, formidable figure in her own right who had genuine power over Chico. She probably didn't have the power to keep him from, being unfaithful. She didn't have the power to cure his gambling addiction, which, as Maxine is quick to point out, was an addiction. It was a sickness. It wasn't an easy thing to just stop. But she makes it clear that Betty was, for one thing, funny, for another thing, tough, that people didn't mess with Betty. Betty wasn't intimidated by the other Marx brothers, which is really saying something. Betty was left on her own, pregnant with Maxine in the bitterest Chicago winter, with only Minnie Marx, a fairly indifferent Minnie Marx there to see her through the pregnancy. Betty was really tough and really made of solid stuff. I also thought it was fascinating to hear Maxine talk about Betty's appropriation of the Greenbaum warning. We all know that in Chicago, the Marx Brothers' landlord was named Greenbaum, and that when the Marx Brothers' onstage antics were threatening to derail the act and compromise its success or infuriate the vaudeville managers, Minnie would hiss at them from the wings, Greenbaum, to remind them that the family's livelihood was dependent on their work, and they had to keep in line so that the rent could be paid. Well, Maxine writes, years later, Chico would pull himself away from a losing streak when one of Betty's well-placed Greenbaums cleared his gambling-fogged mind. Wow. Betty knew to step into the voice of Chico's mother and say the thing that his mother had said to get him to stop fooling around on stage. I mean, in addition to the many Freudian implications here, it really says something about what Betty knew and what she was capable of doing in her effort to keep this thing on the rails.
Which also brings me to another point, which again just hadn't occurred to me, hadn't struck me as significant until Maxine says so here, which is that Betty was Jewish, and the other Marx wives weren't. And she says Chico didn't have the antipathy toward Jewish women that his brothers Harper and Groucho showed. Betty was just the type of Jewish girl they shied away from. Bossy and abrasive, she knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to tell you so. Chico admired her guts, while his brothers preferred docile shiksas.
Yeah, really interesting, and not a point that, although the point has been hanging there for anyone to take and talk about, I don't think anyone else has talked about this. It's one of those times when it seems like Jewish, although Jewish is the specific thing we're talking about here because these are Jewish people. In a way, the word Jewish and the idea of Jewishness here, it's like a stand-in for the idea of authenticity, of like unregulated emotion and a kind of earthy, instinctual way of living, an unconcern with appearances, and a meeting of one's animal needs that is unapologetic.
So we have their whirlwind romance, and we have their kind of spur of the moment marriage, and we're told that Groucho was so offended that he wasn't invited that he didn't invite them to his wedding 3 years later, which is, you would think, if anything, would cause a permanent rift. I mean, that's an extraordinarily petty thing to do, bearing in mind that nobody was invited, that it was, miles away, and they thought, what the hell, let's get married. To carry that grudge to that extent, that's actually one of the shittiest things I've heard about Groucho, actually, and obviously there are plenty, but that's quite something, isn't it?
It really is, yeah, and it seems like maybe Chico was some of Groucho's, as you say, shittiest moves in this area do seem to have been reserved for Chico. Naming the dog Chico, that's a story told elsewhere that Maxine also tells. It seems like Groucho's frustration with Chico was extremely high, and Groucho was, more frustrated in general than the others. And yeah, he's hard on Chico. I had many times reading Maxine's book over the last week, I've thought that, on the podcast and in a lot of what we say and write about the Marx Brothers, I think that we sometimes feel like acting as a corrective to the idea, sometimes excessively expressed, that Groucho Marx was some kind of abusive monster, that he was horrible and he was abusive and tormented the people close to him. And we have often said, well, it's easy to go too far with this. He was a complicated man. He had bad moments, but he was a very decent man. He was not usually malicious. He was, that's all true. But reading Maxine's book, and there's other things you can read that make you think about this too. You think, all right, Groucho, boy, on a bad day, he was not a nice man. And he could be particularly cold to the people close to him.
Yeah. Later on, she says, which I think is also interesting, I wouldn't learn till I was about 10 that Groucho could be loving and dear only with children. With adults, he always feared rejection and developed a steel exterior, which, with his cruel wit, often made him a sneering, bullying figure. Daddy used to say that Groucho would insult a king to make a beggar laugh. He would insult the beggar too, if my experience was any judge. Throughout my childhood, I was hungry for attention and a kind word, but Uncle Groucho's loving ways were abruptly withdrawn when I reached adolescence.
Yeah, interesting point, and it seems true. I feel like this is a point that has been touched on elsewhere, although perhaps not as vividly as it is here in Maxine's book. The idea that Groucho had this openness and tenderness with children that wasn't available to him in his dealings with adults.
And we also have when she's talking about Betty being more forthright than the other Marx Brothers tended to like in a woman, and them having a meeting with Chico to for him to tell her to tone it down a bit. We also have her saying that it was Betty that told Groucho that he didn't look good with a real moustache, so he shaved it off. Now I'm wondering, does the time period here coincide with those 2 or 3 photos we have of Groucho with a real moustache when he's younger, looking, I always think, rather Turkish?
Yes.
I think he should have a fez on. Does that coincide with this story? So is that, in fact, do we probably have Betty to thank for the process that ended up with the grease paint moustache?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. This occurred to me when reading, and it's entirely possible. I think what you're saying. I think it's not quite possible from Maxine's text to put an exact year on the anecdote where she talks about this. I also think there's more than one time when we catch Groucho, a young Groucho with a real mustache. There's some photographs from about 1925 that are like that. And I think there's also earlier in the 20s, maybe 20 or 21, there are a couple of photos of him with a real mustache. So he seems to have experimented with it more than once. But yes, it's entirely possible that Betty is responsible for that aspect of Groucho's look.
We get some interesting stuff as well about Betty being in the act with them, which is all good stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, there seems to have been almost a pragmatic decision, like being in the act is a way to keep an eye on Chico. Much the way Minnie put Zeppo in the act in order to keep an eye on him. And it seems like with the Marx Brothers comedy act being the family business for this group of kind of wild people who are hard to corral and keep tabs on, any one of whom left to his own devices might well destroy the world. The act was almost like a playpen, a place where you could just put all of these problem children and keep tabs on them. It's really, Maxine is, I guess, the source for that incredible line of minis that pops up in some of the other books when they're planning their trip to London, their first British tour in 1922, I think it is. And originally they were planning not to bring Minnie with them to England. And she writes them this, what Maxine calls a hurt and angry note, in which Minnie says, "I am a maker of men, and everything you are, you owe to me." And there was a clap of lightning and thunder, and the sky darkened, and the seas parted. My God, this is like Oppenheimer. I am become death, This is so dramatic for Minnie to put it that way, but okay.
So then Maxine comes along, and we are told a couple of interesting things about her arrival. We're told that she was named after the actress Maxine Elliott. So that means that the first M named child was only incidentally or coincidentally named in honor of Minnie.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I noticed that too and had the same thought. Right. So did the Minnie thing have anything to do with it or not? It seems like Maxine would have said that if it was part of her thinking about it. But she must have realized that all her female cousins had M names also. And it's very interesting.
And we're also told that the next day, Chico tossed a coin to see who would be the godfather, and Gummo came out as the winner, which is very interesting because, as you know, we discovered a few years ago that on her birth certificate she was actually called Maxine Gummo.
Yeah.
So that seems to be, the origin of that stupid quixotic gesture.
Yes, at last. I agree with you, and it is puzzling and quixotic. Gummo is puzzling and enigmatic, if not quixotic, in Maxine's account. She has very little to say about him, and she even says after he quit the act, she hardly ever saw him again. And yet she does mention a detail about Gummo that I don't think we've encountered somewhere else. She says at family reunions, I would hear his big, wheezy laugh. But, that's interesting. That's like a detail a child would notice and would remember.
Yes.
That Gummo had a big, wheezy laugh. I haven't heard that anywhere else.
So then we move into the kind of, I think, what most people would find the most interesting section of the book, which is kind of home life with Maxine and Chico and Betty, and obviously some often unpleasant but always astute observations about how that marriage progressed and how it was perceived by a child living with them. And I think an even-handedness. I mean, she's very frank in saying that growing up, she would always take Chico's side. And was very, very hard on her mother. So she acknowledges that she did that, and she also says, now looking back, I can see that that it wasn't really like that. But we also get just lots of interesting stories about what it was like to grow up with Chico for a father. There's a lovely piece, for instance, about when Chico called her over to watch some ants who had a dead grasshopper.
Yeah.
And she says, we looked on for an hour as the ants struggled in slow motion with their feast. This was the side of him that I loved best, his ability to meet me on my own ground without a note of condescension. As we talked about the difficulties of ant life, his eyes shined with the excitement of the moment. He convinced me that this was the most thrilling hour he had ever spent. That was Chico's way, and his great attraction. His life consisted of an endless series of intense flashes. Lovely observation, lovely writing.
Yes, just wonderful and beautiful, and that really gives you a picture, a beautiful picture of Chico as this man just excited to watch ants lay siege to a dead grasshopper with his daughter. And it also touches on his fascination with animals, which we have heard about elsewhere, and it's one of those keys to Chico's personality, it seems. She also says later in the book, Chico was fascinated by wild animals and read incessantly about them. One of the high points of his youth had been to meet the man who had brought the first gorilla in captivity to America. When Chico died, he left my sons his collection of animal books. It's just really interesting and lovely, and it gives you a sense of, as she keeps describing Chico as a seductive person, as just a person who made life seem like more fun. She also says, and this seems like such a perceptive statement, in comparing Harpo and Chico. She says, a few minutes with Harpo had you convinced that he was the most wonderful person in the world. The same amount of time spent with Daddy had you convinced that you were the most wonderful person in the world.
Yeah. And it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because we are so used to this idea of him as somebody who spent, literally days on end without sleep in card games and would stay out all night and was sexually voracious. That you tend to assume that he has kind of a Harpo degree of literacy and curiosity about the wider world, but it would seem not. I mean, it's incredible that this person who would literally hawk his furniture to pay off debts would have a collection of animal books.
Yeah,
she's not talking about him watching the National Geographic television documentaries or reading about animals in a newspaper. She's saying he had a collection of animal books.
Yeah, it just seems so rich. I mean, you can run the risk of doing too much armchair psychoanalysis, based on one little piece of information. But Chico Marx's fascination with wild animals, I mean, to the point where he, kept and owned books about them and studied them. There's an anecdote we've discussed before about them being in London, going to the London Zoo and just being hungry to talk to zoologists and ask them questions about animals. It seemed to, it's tempting to say that he felt maybe that he could learn to understand himself better and his own, urge-driven animalistic sort of existence, by studying animals, their unself-consciousness and their, simple kind of need-meeting daily lives. Who knows? But it's certainly fascinating.
And there's that lovely photo, isn't there, which I think is in London, isn't it, of him sort of cradling a badger with a look of, undisguised joy on his face.
Yeah, the badger went to the pole with Admiral Byrd.
So, in general, then, what did you have any other thoughts about what she tells us about the family life, and particularly about the dynamics of the marriage and the dynamics of the parents and the child?
I guess it's all things that we have touched on, but it's that one thing that I certainly have come away with is Maxine wrote a far more candid and insightful and honest book than I remembered, and that is really something to have learned here. This book is not a puff piece. It's not as defensive a book as I remembered, although it is defensive in some ways. And then on top of it, that even the ways in which it is defensive and sort of adoring, it's defensive and adoring in a very intelligent, well-informed, careful, and generally well-justified way. Sometimes she advocates for Chico's importance to the act in ways that seem very legitimate to me and insufficiently explored by successive writers and thinkers. She tells a story about Chico going to her school to speak at a school assembly. And she says, "I couldn't wait for my schoolmates to fall in love with him. He was sensational, playing a lot of his repertoire and joking with the students." Then Maxine goes on to offer this reflection. Chico was the only one of the brothers who had a good solo act. Harpo couldn't talk, and Groucho's humor didn't fit into a monologue routine. He always needed to work off somebody. It's like, oh, yeah. I mean, nobody's ever said this anywhere before because there is no Chico solo act for us to really look at and study and form this opinion. But yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions about the complications of Groucho trying to entertain audiences all by himself on stage toward the end of his career. Harpo, obviously. So yeah, Chico, who could talk, he was a talking comedian, perfectly capable of anecdotes and storytelling, not exactly in Groucho's style, but, he was as capable of those things as Groucho was. And he could sit down and play the piano and be the most spectacularly entertaining thing you've ever seen for one song after another. Oh, what a shame there isn't a 90-minute Chico concert somewhere that we can watch. And maybe the Chico Marx Orchestra, which I've always thought of as this weird footnote at the end, this thing he had to do because altogether now Chico needed the money, maybe the Chico Marx Orchestra and all the time he spent in front of audiences during those years was just as important a part of the body of work of Chico Marx as anything we're familiar with.
Yeah, and she also says in that passage that you've just quoted, Daddy once explained to me that the reason Harpo and Groucho relied so heavily on him was that in any 3 scene, Groucho had to channel his remarks through Chico to Harpo, and Chico had to interpret Harpo to Groucho.
Yeah, I mean, that's a point that other writers and thinkers have made, that there aren't a lot of Groucho-Harpo scenes, and that it's Groucho and Chico most of the time, or Harpo and Chico. And that Chico had an offstage role that was as important as anybody's onstage role. But Maxine's insights here are special, and I feel as though this book has been too often and too easily dismissed, but maybe I only think that because I personally have too often and too easily dismissed it. Maybe others have been much more fair to it, but if you haven't, I would certainly encourage our listeners to sit down with this book and just listen to Maxine's voice for a while. There's an interesting section where in the period between Paramount and MGM, Irving Thalberg hasn't come along yet, and it's one of these, what are we going to do next? Do the Marx Brothers have a future or not kind of moments? And Maxine sort of transcribes a conversation between Harpo and Chico where they're talking on the phone sort of about where the act is right now and what might happen next. And it's so vividly written. It's such a nice piece of dialogue. It's like barely 1 page long, but it's just a phone conversation between Harpo and Chico. But reading it, it feels so real, and it feels like, okay, Maxine really knows what their voices sounded like and what kinds of things they said to each other. And it just seemed like, oh, I wish we had more of this. What would it have been like? Here's an interesting what if to go with some of the what ifs you raised at the beginning of this episode. What if Maxine and not Arthur had been the kind of writer of that generation of Marx children? And, what if Maxine had tried to write Minnie's Boys, or had tried to write a piece that explored the Marx Brothers' relationships in real life? This dialogue she gives Harpo and Chico just feels so real and authentic in a way that, frankly, nothing in Minnie's Boys does, or in Arthur's books about Groucho, which of course have their great value and merits. But I kind of wish Maxine had written more.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Because you do get the feeling as well, don't you, that she is romping through the book, that it could have been 3 times the length and still been fascinating. She glides over things very quickly, and you sometimes want her to just slow down a little, because that was very, very interesting what you said there. If I was editing the book, I think I would have told her to do that. A good case in point, in fact, being the next section of the book when they moved to Hollywood. There are some very vivid kind of pencil sketches of Hollywood lifestyle and the Hollywood community. There's some great stuff about George Kaufman and Moss Hart. There's some amusing anecdotes that I didn't remember seeing anywhere else. They may be, like for instance, Chico having a habit of stealing money from Sam Wood's wallet.
Yes.
Which is quite good. But also reading her take on the extremely well-known and widely told story of Chico swinging the Thalberg deal. I rather got the feeling that it started to make some sense about his billing change. That you could almost you could see that being part of that deal that he read, because she talks about them getting percentage points up front and various other perks that they didn't have before, and you can easily imagine him doing that, and in fact. There was a post in our Facebook group quite recently from I'm reasonably sure from Eddie Deason, where he was talking about the mystery of Chico jumping up to second place, and suggesting that maybe Betty might have been the voice in his ear prompting that, and I thought it's quite an interesting sort of suggestion, but didn't take it any further. But there is this interesting passage, isn't there, about Betty telling Chico that every time you have a good gag, the camera's on Groucho. He's always upstaging you. You can't be funny if they can't see you. Next time you have a story conference, assert yourself more. So we do actually get an anecdote about Betty kind of compelling him to not be laid back and to put his best interests, to the fore, which I think kind of supports the idea that Eddie Deason had there.
Yes, indeed. It's very interesting. And the outcome of that is interesting, too, with Chico coming back to Betty and telling her, Groucho and Harpo need the spotlight. I just need the act to be good. Basically saying they need to feel good about our work. I need a paycheck. Really very interesting. And Betty being defensive of Chico's role kind of makes you feel like Maxine inherited that responsibility from her mother in some ways, like, okay, Chico's life is about being his own champion on other points besides like being an important comedian. That's not actually what matters to Chico. It's a means to an end. So we're going to have to be the ones to argue that Chico Marx is a great comedian and is no less important a member of the Marx Brothers. Also, the important point that Chico and Betty and Irving Thalberg and Norma Shearer were all friends, that like Chico did have a closer personal friendship with Irving Thalberg than the other brothers did. It wasn't just that they were both card players and therefore they happened to have a conversation over a card game. On the other hand, Maxine does give Chico the Paramount Adolf Zucker story, "You're the one showman in the world," and all that, which we generally think that was actually Zeppo who made that deal and not Chico. So there's at least that one example.
There's also, as well, she does say, doesn't she, at one point that the brothers had a tendency to kind of share out these stories, and one time it would be Harpo, and another time it would be Chico, and so on. And we do have as well, we have Harpo here laying claim to the story of being shown W.C. Fields' booze collection in case Prohibition comes back, which is normally a Groucho story, but we have Harpo doing it here, don't we?
Yeah, they seem to have been just freely borrowing from each other as far as that stuff goes. Really interesting. And oddly, sometimes when a story is one way everywhere and another way in just one place, it's the different one that seems more true.
Yes.
It's also interesting the way she describes this sense of the Marx Brothers as a unit, a sort of unbreakable brotherly bond that was more important than anything else in the lives of each brother, and what it was like to be a child in the middle of that. She describes a scene, a sort of weird and difficult scene, something that should challenge the authors of whatever Marx Brothers biopic ever happens someday. She talks about having given Chico a scolding for his irresponsibility, for his unfaithfulness to Betty and all the ways in which he was disappointing. And Harpo scolds her for it. Harpo comes down, pulls Maxine aside and says don't say that about your father. And Maxine writes, "I look back on this incident with mixed emotions. I realize how close the Marx Brothers were. Often in their careers, they had an us against them attitude. Certainly, I can see how their mutual regard for one another and their devotion to the act made them intolerant of anyone else's criticism, especially coming from within the family. On the other hand, it had never occurred to Harpo to sit down and talk to me seriously about my father's gambling and women, because Harpo and his brothers were insensitive to the causes of Daddy's problems. Just as Harpo treated Chico's gambling as a simple problem of willpower, so he looked on my actions as simple disloyalty." Wow. Okay. So, the Marx Brothers has this tight unit, all for one and one for all and two for five and six for a quarter. That, we know that. We feel like that's beautiful about them. And that's one of the things that made them great. And it is. But, what was it like to be the daughter? When you're a little kid, you want to be the most important thing in your father's life, if not your uncle's lives too. You don't want to feel like your father is devoted to your uncles in a way that he will never be devoted to you. That's very sad.
Yes, and not only that, but devoted to uncles who were frequently, very, very harsh with him. She also says, doesn't she, neither of his brothers seemed to understand that Chico's incessant gambling was a sickness. Harpo was particularly unsympathetic.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, doesn't it? That jibes with all the wonderful things we know about Harpo, too. The world for Harpo was a simpler place than it was for most of us. He wouldn't appreciate the complexity of addiction. Harpo was seemingly so free of those kinds of complexities.
As a side note, she does talk briefly about the College Bowl, the TV series that Chico made in the 1950s, and I sat down this afternoon and watched that for I think at most the third time in my life, maybe the second time in my life, and certainly with undivided attention for the first time in my life. It's weird, isn't it? Nothing happens in it. Absolutely nothing happens in it. It's a half-hour show. It was apparently the last one of a series, and absolutely nothing happens in it. And the star, Chico Marx, does virtually nothing.
Yeah, I've heard some more recent television shows and movies described as hang movies. It's a hang movie. Nothing happens in it. You're just kind of hanging with this set of characters for a half hour or an hour or whatever it is. College Bowl is like that. It's just kind of a hang. You're in an environment with a set of characters, and it goes on for X number of minutes, and then it's over.
And lots of lovely Chicoing, of course. Everybody calls him Chico. He
Yes.
he says his name once on the phone, doesn't he? He says, "This is a Chico rebellion." Everybody else, it's Chico, Chico, Chico.
Yes.
Lovely. I do like to hear people saying Chico.
Well, one thing it proves, and I think we on our episode when we talked about the College Bowl and Papa Romani too, which has a different and definitely Papa Romani has a has dramatic kind of momentum to it, more so than the College Bowl. But they demonstrate that Chico could have been a TV star pretty easily, and in this kind of setting, in a situation comedy setting, he actually would have been pretty easy to write for and represent. This would not have been the greatest height of Chico as an iconoclastic comedian. He couldn't have done what he does in Animal Crackers on a sitcom in the 1950s. But as a lovable dialect comedian playing this avuncular character, he could have thrived on American television for decades. Easier to write for than Groucho.
Yes, yeah, and obviously Papa Romani gives us a rather better kind of hint of where he could have gone. I mean, you can imagine that having been picked up and lasting a season or two, couldn't you? I think.
Absolutely. Just as, the idea of, in some alternate dimension, some other reality, Chico seemingly could have had a career as a serious character actor in bit parts, in film noirs and so forth.
Yes, she does say interestingly here, doesn't she, that play he's in towards the end of his life. She says it was a real kind of step out of his comfort zone.
Yes.
And he rose to the challenge, even though he was quite ill by then and not reliable in any way. He actually took a risk and was a complete. It was a vindication for him.
Yeah, that's the 5th season, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
So again, I mean, I'm coming back to Chico at Carnegie Hall, but you can imagine, rather than Groucho there singing "Hello, I Must Be Going" with a stand-in Dumont. You can almost see him with a stand-in Groucho doing his rates for not rehearsing to sycophantic applause.
Well, Chico, what do you usually charge for playing?
Well, for playing, $10 an hour.
Well, what do you charge for not playing?
$20 an hour.
Well, what do you charge for rehearsing?
$30 an hour.
Now, wait a minute, Chico. What do you charge for not rehearsing?
Oh, that runs into money.
Now, look, Chico, how much will it cost if you don't rehearse and if you don't play?
Oh, you couldn't afford it.
Well, what would you charge to drop into an open manhole?
Just for cover charge.
Why don't you drop in sometime?
Sewer. That cleans that up pretty good, eh?
He has enough stuff that is his to make that a permissible fantasy, I think.
Absolutely. And also an aspect of his performance, his piano playing, I would think was a talent of his that did not age. Chico didn't get to be as old a man as Groucho did, of course. But, if we could have had a Chico at a very advanced age giving the kind of concert where the voice is quieter and slower and the wit is a little slower and not as sharp, and you're kind of reconciling the aged figure in front of you with his more energetic, youthful, cinematic self. But as soon as he starts playing the piano, it's going to sound like it always did, like that part of his voice, as long as the dexterity in his fingers was with him, and apparently it was right to the end, always would have been there. I mean, imagine if Groucho had a talent like that would show no signs of age.
Mm. Well, the rest of the book is kind of a two-hander, isn't it? She talks about her own early breaking away from the family and her attempts to become an actress, and then she goes on to talk about meeting the person who becomes her husband. Quite an amusing story about her pretending to be French.
Yes.
And contrasted with that, and kind of laced through it are the final years of Chico, and first of all the final years of his first marriage. And I'd often wondered if there was a particular, because it seemed to have just rubbed along for so long, being unsatisfying to both of them. I'd often wondered if there was a particular catalyst to cause the irrevocable end of it. And she says that there was, and what's more, she blames herself for causing it.
Yes, that Chico finally crossed the line that, as far as Betty knew, he hadn't yet crossed, which was to make moves toward another woman under their own roof, a friend of Maxine's. I mean, this is one of the more egregious things a father can do, which is make sexual advances toward your daughter's friend while she's at your house, supposedly to spend time with your daughter. So that's obviously an extremely crummy thing to do. And for Betty, the last straw, it seems to have been something that Betty had made known. This is something I will not accept. I'll put up with a lot from you, Chico Marx, but not that. And I think Betty got to the point where, just as a matter of personal pride, she could no longer roll over in the face of this kind of treatment.
We then get to find out a little bit about Mary, Chico's second wife. It's good to have some colour filled into that fairly unknown part of the story. And also, I think Maxine here is notably generous towards her. You could easily imagine her just having a very negative portrait of her, but she's not. It's very generous, and She says good things about her, doesn't she?
She does, yeah, and she seems to just have recognized, as many people in that situation have, that if I want to have a relationship with this person who's one of the most important people in my life, my father, then I also am going to have to accept and have a relationship with the person he's chosen as a partner, even if the circumstances under which their relationship began, were difficult for my household and family life. It's the kind of that kind of personal maturity from Maxine that's refreshing to hear, from anybody in this saga. I also just want to, this is an absolute sidebar, but it was, to me, one of the really amusing, heartwarming details of the book. I'm reminded of it because you reference her anecdote about meeting her husband, Seamus Culhane, and having pretended to be French during their original introduction. So Maxine could speak a little French and had studied French, and Chico is very proud of his daughter for knowing French, or at least being somewhat fluent in French, so that whenever they met anyone French, Chico apparently would push Maxine toward that person and say, "Talk French." They run into Charles Boyer at the studio. "Talk French," Chico said, pushing me forward. So good. I mean, that is just, okay, now I have a picture of Chico Marx as a father. "Hey, kid, talk French." Another story like that comes in the book that is just so vivid to me. It just makes Chico so real. She's talking about this another time when he's in London. He's spending time in England. Maxine writes, Chico and the Duke of Manchester had become bridge buddies, and Chico and Betty had been guests at his castle. But, Chico added, those people were kind of boring. I guess the life of cucumber sandwiches and tea hadn't awed the brothers much. "What did you say to the Duke, Daddy?" I asked, thinking of court protocol. "Hiya, Duke," he replied in his best New Yorkese.
And there's another very good embarrassing dad story, isn't there, where she talks about having a crush on Spencer Tracy, and getting to the point where she considered actually writing a note to him, saying that she has sort of serious feelings for him, but if she sees him with with Chico, and Chico kind of shouts across the studio lot, doesn't he? Hey, my daughter's got a crush on you, and he comes over and pats her head.
Yes, a pat on the head. Yeah, it's great. It's so good to have those kind of anecdotes. Like, for every anecdote about Chico being monstrous or at least frustratingly selfish, there are these great, funny anecdotes about him that you can't find anywhere else.
And as he moves fairly swiftly then towards his death, there are two nice touches. One is she again very generously makes the point that Mary, who could have cut her losses, in fact stood by him and was extremely supportive and helpful as he became very ill. But there's also a fabulous scene, isn't there, where he's in a hospital having had a major heart attack. And she goes into his hospital room, and Groucho and Harpo are already in there, and they start telling her an anecdote, kind of almost like a performance, where the three of them, will pick up the thread and say a bit, and then one of the others will do a bit, and Harpo acts out some of it physically, and she says, Chico kind of lost 10 years of age and illness as they were doing this. That is a ready-made biopic last scene, isn't it?
Yeah, and absolutely, no doubt about it.
So there we are then, Growing Up with Chico by Maxine Marx, and I think we would both say to anyone who either hasn't read it at all or hasn't read it for a while, it's well worth taking off your shelf and having another shufti at it.
And it is still to this day the only book about Chico Marx. Only, that centers Chico Marx, we'll say. All of the Marx Brothers books are about Chico Marx in some way. And we know that coming pretty soon, there will at long last be a Zeppo book, Robert Bader's biography, we're all waiting for eagerly. But this is still the only book about Chico, and the only book we'll ever have from a child of Chico. Well worth reading, and I think I'm not sure exactly what my official ranking is of Marx Brothers books, and I'm personally friendly with too many authors of Marx Brothers books to ever make that ranking public. But I think after this reading of Growing Up with Chico, wherever I would rank this book, it's risen several notches in my estimation, and in my private ranking of Marx Brothers books. Growing Up with Chico is much higher on the list than I had thought it was.
And I concur. So before we go, do you have a Patreon update for us?
I do. We are just rolling along with Patreon. We want to welcome and thank all of our recent subscribers, and we have had a spike in subscribers. Some of the exciting things we've been through recently, I think, have drawn more people to the podcast and the Patreon. I'm talking about our big contest at the end of last year, where we gave away a Coconuts poster signed by the real Groucho Marx. And also our last episode, which was a big one with Mike Rowe and the virtually unheard audio of Groucho's interview with Raymond Rohauer in 1967. That's in our previous episode for any listeners who might have missed it. And many have climbed on board, I think, as a result of these exciting developments. And, of course, the bonus segment last month, which also featured our guest, Mr. Mike Rowe, and some Groucho video that very few of the fans have seen before. Just a reminder, when you subscribe to our Patreon at any level, you instantly get access to our bonus segments, including all of the past bonus segments, which means if you join right now, you will have over a year's worth of monthly extra bonus segments. It's like getting hours of additional podcast content right away. And just think of how much of your life you can waste listening to us talk about the Marx Brothers. Postcard number 14, the February postcard, is sitting right here on my desk as we record this. As you listen to it, the postcard will already be flying through the mail to your mailbox if you are a subscriber at one of the top 4 levels. If you become a subscriber right now, we will send you this postcard and also the last few postcards. So you'll get a little bonus in the postcard department too. And this February postcard, after some wonderful guest entries lately, has a design by me. Apologize for that. We'll have a good artist back soon to do something good.
Okay, so now it's time for our final song, and in a way, I guess my choice is quite self-explanatory, but I do feel compelled to explain it. 2 nights ago, I actually dreamed that we were recording this podcast, and for some reason, in my dream, I chose to end it with a song that I don't think I've heard or even thought about in over 40 years, but my dream self chose it as the final song. Now, obviously, that seemed perfectly normal in the dream, as weird things in dreams always do. But when I woke, I was much amused by the inexplicable absurdity of it. But the damage was done, and so I have decided to end with it for real. Partly because it provides me with my final Chico what if. What if Chico had lived into the age of the novelty comedy pop single? If he had, it's no stretch at all to picture him risking tarnishing his legacy with something exactly like this. So here is a song that was a worldwide hit back in 1981 and which topped the British pop charts for 3 consecutive weeks. It's Joe Dolce with Shut Up Your Face.
Hello, I'm Giuseppe. I got something special for you. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. When I was a boy, just about the 8th grade, Mama used to say, don't stay out late with the bad boys. Always shoot the pool. Giuseppe going to flunk school. Boy, it make me sick, all the thing I gotta do. I can't get no kicks, I always got to follow rules. Boy, it make me sick, just to make the lousy bucks. Got to feel like a fool. And the mama used to say all the time, what's the matter you? Hey, gotta no respect. What do you think you do? Why you look so sad? It's not so bad, it's a nicer place. Ah, shut up your face. That's my mom, I can remember. Big accordion solo. Play that thing. Really nice, really nice. But soon there come a day, gonna be a big star. Then they make a TV shows and the movies. Get myself a new car, but still I be myself. I don't want it to change a thing. Still I dance and I sing. I think about the mama, she used to say, what's the matter you? Hey, God, no respect. What do you think you do? Why you look so sad? It's not so bad, it's a nicer place. Ah, shut up your face. Mama, she said it all of the time. What's the matter you? Hey, God, no respect. What do you think you do? Why you look so sad? It's not so bad, it's a nicer place. Ah, shut up your face. That's my mom. Hello, everybody. That's out there on the radio and the TV land. Did you know I had a big hit the song in Italy with this? Shut up your face. I sing this song, all of my fans applaud, they clap their hands. That's making me feel so good. You ought to learn this song, it's real simple. See, I sing, what's the matter you? You sing, hey. Then I sing the rest. And then at the end, we can all sing, ah, shut up your face. Okay, let's try it really bit. 1, 2, 3, 4. What's the matter you? Hey, God, no respect. Hey, what do you think you do? Hey, why you look so sad? Hey, it's not so bad. Hey, it's a nicer place. Ah, shut up your face. That's great. We're gonna do the best this time with that tape. What's the matter, you? Hey, got no respect. Hey, what do you think you do? Hey, why you look so sad? Hey, it's not so bad. Hey, it's a nicer place. Shut up in your face. Okay, one time for mama, everybody. What's the matter, you? Hey, got no respect. Hey, what do you think you do? Hey, why you look so sad? Hey, it's not so bad. Hey, it's a nicer place. Shut up in your face.
The Marx Brothers Council podcast is produced by Bob Gassell. Matthew Cunningham's books, The Annotated Marx Brothers, and That's Me, Groucho, are published by McFarland. Noah Diamond's book, Give Me a Thrill, The Story of All Say She is published by Bear Manor Media. For more info on this and all episodes, visit our website at marxbrotherscouncilpodcast.com. Also look for us on Twitter. And for the place to talk Marx and meet fellow fans, join us on the lively Marx Brothers Council Facebook group. See you next time!
I was very amused to read in Maxine's interesting description of her maternal grandmother's funeral. She's writing about her grandmother, Betty Karp's mother, Grandma Karp, and what she has to say about this woman who was, as Maxine characterizes her, completely lost the day she left the Russian shtetl village where she was from, and barely spoke English and was suddenly in this world of Hollywood and show business and wealth and everything. Anyway, in her description of Grandma Karp's funeral, Maxine mentions that Harpo and Chico were impossible because for some reason, whenever they heard Hebrew spoken, it made them laugh. Throughout the service, they made faces at each other and at the rabbi, trying to break each other up. Groucho, who wasn't as close to Grandma Karp as his brothers, was the only one to behave with proper respect. That really rang a bell with me. I've been there, that world where you're Jewish enough to be at a Jewish funeral, but you're not so Jewish that sometimes the sound of very serious, portentous people speaking Hebrew at key moments, it just sometimes sounds funny. It can really make you laugh. And I have been that giggler, trying hard to keep it together, or trying or witnessing someone else in the midst of that same struggle.
Me too. Yeah, not at a funeral, but at a Jewish wedding. My wife's Jewish, and our son Edward, who would have been about 5 at the time, had no idea of Hebrew, had never encountered it, so he thought it was absolutely hilarious that there's this incredibly kind of dignified and obviously important man kind of went to the front of this large congregation of people and basically spoke gibberish. He really thought it was funny. So yes,
yeah, it's a real thing. It's especially in liturgical settings when it's that cantorial, very heavy, very portentous sound. It's not just someone chattering away in a foreign language, but it just sounds so dramatic and so serious. That's why it seems so funny.
There's actually a few good funeral stories in the book, isn't there? Not least Chico's own funeral, where it's a lovely detail where she tells the rabbi to say that he was the least malicious of men, and he says that he was the least mischievous of men.
Yeah. Yes, and Groucho and Harpo coming out of Chico's funeral kind of angry at the eulogy.
Yes.
Groucho saying, I should have done it myself. And it's interesting. On one hand, I'm sure that's all true. It does sound like that was a strange way to commemorate Chico Marx. On the other hand, at this very dark moment for them personally and as a professional comedy team, here we are without any ability to bring the Marx Brothers back ever again now. There's no more Chico. there's no more act. And what Groucho and Harpo involve themselves with is an adamant bad review of the rabbi's eulogy. Just something sweet about that.